Hi everyone, and welcome to this discussion this morning on building a FAIR roadmap for research software. I'm Michelle Barker, the Director of the Research Alliance, and I'll be working with a few colleagues listed here today who will be presenting different parts of the agenda to take us through a discussion of what it might mean to build a FAIR roadmap for research software. Is that a sensible idea? Are we the right people to do it? What are the kinds of things that exist to enable that? On the shared screen, you should be able to see my slide deck. And at the bottom, there's a link to the collaborative notes. And if Neil or Dan could put that into the chat for everyone, that would be fantastic. It has a link to this slide deck as well. All right, I will just talk for a couple of minutes now to welcome you all and to talk a little bit about the aims. And this work builds heavily on the work of the FAIR4RS Software Working Group. So Dan will take us through that. And this agenda is also in those collaborative notes if you'd like to refer to it throughout our time. And then we'll have a brief session of written introductions using one of the online polling tools, menti.com. We'll just ask you to talk a little bit about who you are and your interest or what you can bring today using Menti, because at the end of today, we'll have lots of discussion where people can talk more about their own interests and what they are hoping to get from this group. For about 20 minutes, we will have 3 talks that will help set the scene. So first of all, we have a talk from CHAOS, the Community Health Analytics Open Source Software Group, who can give us some advice, some examples of how software metrics are being created and as a building block if we want to go ahead with this endeavor. Then we have a talk from Francoise Genova, who is one of the co-chairs of the EOSC, or European Open Science Cloud FAIR working group, as an example of where there's been work done on FAIR metrics related to other research objects, particularly to data, but where we could learn from some of that work and the effort of applying the FAIR principles to data more generally as well. And then Yehudi from Wellcome Trust is going to talk to us about one of the projects they're involved in called FAIRware, which is a use case of a group of funders needing some metrics for identifying the fairness of software fairly soon to see if that can motivate us to think about doing this work and show the benefits of doing so. And finally, as I said, most of our chat today will have an hour and a half led by Chue Hong, where we will be discussing as a group the validity of moving forward and how we might want to do that, and then what everyone would be able to bring in terms of involvement. So that's our agenda for today. If you have questions any time, please put them into the chat and someone will do their best to make sure I or the speaker is able to address them. In terms of our aim today, we've pitched it as a scoping discussion because it's the first chat really around the possibility of doing this work. And so we wanted to identify stakeholders interested in planning how to create FAIR metrics or indicators, depending what terminology you want to use for research software. There was maybe 25 people invited to join this meeting, and people were able to invite other people as well. So it wasn't a publicly advertised meeting, but it wasn't completely closed, an invitation only. So we hope we've been able to get a relevant group joining us today, and we're delighted you could all be here to begin this discussion and then see how we want to broaden it out with the hope that as a group we would decide at some point to make it publicly, to publicize it to anyone who is interested. There's a little bit of background. There's a working definition of metrics there. The metrics to be used, we need metrics that can be used to indicate how fair research software is in different aspects, and we aim for community definitions that are transparent and actionable. And the talk from CHAOS will probably talk more about what we mean by metrics. This information, we're recording the first half of this meeting, which is the talks, and then we'll write up a summary of the rest because there were some people who couldn't join us today and wanted to be able to. If you don't wish to be in the recording, then I will try and remember to stop it at the end of the talks, but if you don't unmute and ask questions, then you won't be in the recording. Or if you have any concerns with the recording, you could put that into the chat now and my colleagues will respond. There's a little bit of background from me. As I said, I'm the director of the Research Software Alliance, and Dan and Neil, some of the co-presenters today, are also some of our steering committee members and co-founders. The Research Software Alliance was founded with the vision of supporting the recognition and valuing of software as a fundamental component of research worldwide. And we work to do that by encouraging collaborations through existing research software organizations. And one of our projects at the moment is the FAIR4RS Software Roadmap. And I'll talk more about what that means shortly. And its vision is to make fair research software a reality. We'll come back to that statement and unpack it a bit more as we go through some of the talks. So as background to understand what the FAIR Roadmap is, I'd now like to invite Dan Katz to talk about the work of the FAIR4RS Software Working Group.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So the FAIR4RS Software Working Group came out of a bunch of different conversations that were going on, and the fact that there was a lot of interest in FAIR in general, and specifically in a question about whether FAIR as written applied to research software or whether there were changes needed. And we wanted to try to bring together a community group under the auspices of ReSA, of RDA, and of Force 11 to bring people together to try to answer this, and to do it in a way where hopefully the things that come out can be viewed as a community response. What we have been working on at this point is that we started before we put in the proposal. Sorry, I'm just noticing these dates. I'll say 2020 and not 2021. So all those dates on the previous slide should say 2021. Sorry about that. We started in June, roughly, of last year, 2020. And wrote up a proposal for the 3 different organizations saying this is what we'd like to do. We had a bunch of publicity, and I've gotten, I don't know, something like 140 people or so have been at different events and maybe are on the mailing list to hear about things. And we started 4 different subgroups to try to look at different aspects of what does FAIR for research software mean. Those subgroups have mostly all finished now, or we're trying to bring all of that together into a first draft that we'll have done in March. And then we'll have a period of engaging the community around both the individual reports in some cases, but the collective report mostly overall. And then we would like to have a final set of principles of what does FAIR for research software mean in July. And we should just mention that this work is partially sponsored by Wellcome and Sloan. And so the reason that we're trying to do this is that the FAIR principles, which were first written, as far as I know, in 2016, although the discussion started in 2014, are written in a way that says that they're intended to apply to all research objects. And at the high level of the foundational principles, fair, accessible, interoperable, reusable, those seem to be good principles for all research objects. I think most people would agree. And the details of how that actually happens and what that means has been primarily done in the context of data. But we also have the fact that we need to apply these same kind of operations, discovery, access, integration, and reuse, to other research objects as well, to things like algorithms and software and workflows. And software is stored as data, but it isn't just data. And so that leads us to believe that the way the FAIR principles have been written in detail and have been applied to data may not be the way that they should be written and applied to software. So next. So there's been a bunch of different groups that have been looking at this and looking at aspects of this or all of this, starting in 2017 and going through last year. And there probably are other groups that we're not aware of, but I hope that most groups actually at this point are aware of what we're doing and that we are aware of them. But there was a long period where there were a number of different individual activities going on. And so this is just a list of some of these different activities that have gone on in the past. Next, please. So just to give a tiny bit of kind of where we are at this point, one of the subgroups has been taking a fresh look at the FAIR data principles and trying to say, in the absence of any other group's work, can those be applied to software as they're written? And if not, what kind of changes would be needed? And what we found is that for some of the parts of the principles, in particular findable and accessible, the changes that we need to apply to software really is mostly just a wording change where we just need to change data to software. And so this is quite straightforward, both for the foundational principle as well as the guiding principles underneath. But for interoperable and reusable, there are many more changes that are needed because mostly because the definition of what interoperable and reusable means is nowhere near as clear as it is what FAIR and accessible, or what findable and accessible mean. And so part of the question is, what assumptions do we make when we do this, and then what principles come out of those assumptions? And so in particular here, we have the original data principles. We have this group that I led that put out a preprint on archive, which is on the which is linked at the bottom. And we have a group that Annalena, who's on, led, that came up with a paper last year. And we have a group that Neil has been leading that's coming up with a different set of definitions. And so the work that we're going to do now is to try to bring all of that together and to try to look at these different assumptions and understand how do we decide which of these we should actually be following and which set of principles that follows is the right one. So I think that's kind of where we are in terms of principles. And then I think next Michelle is going to talk about kind of what we do after we have principles. How do we actually go somewhere with those principles? How do we make them have some effect on the community?
Thanks, Dan. And as Dan said, sorry, I've just skipped a slide. Once we have the principles, which are on track to be released, to have been fully developed and gone through some community consultation process by July of this year, that will be a fantastic achievement for us all. But if we look at the experience of the FAIR principles release in 2016 and their application to data, there has been a huge amount of work since then to think about how to get the FAIR principles adopted and implemented, at least in a data context. So it would be reasonable to think once we have the FAIR for research software principles, we will need to do something similar in the software sector. So to give us a taste of what that could look like, we can look at some of the work about implementing FAIR data. This is a graphic from the European Commission's 2018 work, Turning FAIR into Reality, which showed a number of areas where they were identifying that work needed to be done to improve the adoption or implementation of the FAIR principles for data in areas such as culture and ecosystem and skills, to give us some idea on the kinds of areas we're going to also have to apply the FAIR principles to software. We did some work brainstorming some of those that might be most relevant to the software sector and came up with this list of possible things that the roadmap might have to focus on. So if we restate the aim of the roadmap, of which we hope this could become a working group, it's to achieve the reality of FAIR research software. So we're looking at which of these kinds of things need to be advanced by who and when. Who could work together, what resourcing is needing, what could be learned from the FAIR data equivalents. And so you'll see that FAIR metrics was one of the possible topics that was brainstormed in this list, FAIR metrics for software. And this was identified as a topic that it would be useful to address quite soon after release of the principles. As we will hear more of, there's already groups who are interested in utilizing FAIR for software metrics. And of course, there are already some early incarnations of that as well that some of you are involved in, and it would be useful to understand what already exists. So that was the background to having this conversation today, that we'd thought about where else we needed to do some thinking about how to use the principles, where might be some of the areas that we need to start. Metrics came out top of the pile. There's other ones in that list which we'll try and kick off soon as well. And if you're interested in those, please contact me about that. And you were the group of people who we brainstormed and by talking to other people in the community, might be a useful group to start with, who either have an interest in it, are already doing something, may have some kind of FAIR for software metrics tool, might be a use case wanting to apply the metrics in some environment, have a background in the FAIR metrics as applied to data or other research objects, and therefore be able to come together in a conversation to think about what could be next steps in addressing this. So more broadly, the role of the FAIR for Research Software Roadmap is to identify a range of these projects. Could be something that we might end up calling the metrics working group if we agree it's sensible to proceed. To do that for a range of other areas such as FAIR software curriculum and training, certification for FAIR software services like repositories, FAIR software governance, and to map those into a longer term framework over the next 2 to 3 years of all that needs to be done to guide further investment, to identify those stakeholders, and also to think about elements that are specific to research software. We brainstormed a lot of things looking at the experience of applying the FAIR principles to data, but there may be areas that are quite new that we need to incorporate as well. So thank you to the Wellcome Trust for their support of this roadmap work. If you wanted to look at our thinking on the roadmap so far, that's the URL to the document, and you can see this is where we initially brainstormed who might be interested in the metrics conversation and have already done some work that we could think about getting some coordination across.
All right, well, thanks. It's good to see a bunch of people on the call that are new people that I haven't met and people that I've seen before. So I'm Matt Germonprez, and I'm at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and I'm joined by Sean Goggins, who is on this call, who's a colleague and friend of mine at the University of Missouri. And we are both board members of the CHAOSS project and some of the original co-founders. I'd like to just say thanks to the Sloan Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and Mozilla for their support of this project. Just watching the time. All right. So the CHAOSS project is a Linux Foundation project. And we started in 2017. And the goal was to help organizations get a better understanding of the health and sustainability of the open source projects that they connect with, right? So as open source has become a critical part of infrastructure for everybody, gaining a better understanding of the health of those associated projects was really important for a lot of people. So we kind of started out with just developing this long list of metrics, like any metric that we could think of that might provide insight into open source community health. So it didn't work so well. So to say the least, we ended up with this giant list of metrics and it really made no sense at all. So not all metrics are the same. The way that you have to collect data around metrics can be quite different. So trace data is one form, sometimes surveys or interviews are needed. So in this example, metrics around diversity and inclusion with respect to open source communities really take a different approach than say trying to understand the risk associated with an open source project. We came into this issue of how they were interpreted. So I seem to recall we had a really long conversation on small things like what a commit is to a project. So there was a lot of work that needed to be done. And so metrics alone don't carry context. So we really realized that we needed to kind of start putting these into a frame that would really help people gain a better understanding of the pieces of software and the communities they were interested in. And ultimately the CHAOSS project is, and this is a connection here, that we're a community that listens. So we certainly don't have all of the answers when it comes to here are the metrics you need for say, interoperability, or here are all the metrics you need for reusability. We don't know what those are, but we're there to help kind of help that process along by which you can gain insight into these particular areas. So presently we're structured around what we call focus areas. And so these are the focus areas: D&I, risk, value, evolution, and common. And within these focus areas, people develop metrics that are meaningful to provide insight to gain a better understanding with respect to D&I, or gain a better understanding with respect to risk. We have 3 pieces of software as well, and I'll talk about the design of these metrics as I think it's relevant here. We also have 3 pieces of software that we use to implement these metrics. So we don't just build metrics for metric's sake. We make sure that they're deployable in tools like Grimoire Lab, or tools like Augur, which Sean leads here on this call, and Craig it as well. So, and we do a lot of our work in Zoom and GitHub. So we do regular cadences of metrics releases. So we do these twice a year. We're very attentive to metrics deployments. So we think consistently about, as we develop metrics, how do we actually put them into practice? So we're not just developing metrics for metric's sake. And we also run chaos cons. So we bring people together. I know a couple people on this call, looking at you, Yo, have been to the chaos cons. Hello. Helped us fantastically tweet that out when we were in Brussels last year. So thank you again for that. That was awesome. And again, we learn from the folks that we're trying to help, right? So again, we don't have all the answers, but we're certainly trying to learn from everybody. Oops, sorry. So these are our focus areas. Again, common, D&I, evolution, risk. Actually, these are our working groups, value. And within each of these, we kind of parcel out how we think about metrics. So in this example, I'll talk about how we think about metrics, say from a D&I perspective. So if we look at D&I, and let's say that we wanted to gain a better understanding of how we understand diversity and inclusion with respect to an open source project, we can break this down. So we need to kind of start stepping away. So we identify particular focus areas. You can see event diversity, governance, leadership. And each of these focus areas has particular goals. So we follow what's called a goal, question, metric approach. So again, we don't develop metrics just for metric's sake. We try to attend to the goals that you are trying to achieve. So you're trying to achieve something, and metrics can help inform that something. And so goals are our first things that we identify. So if you take a look here, say at event diversity, our goal is to identify diversity and inclusion at events. If you look at governance, our goal is to identify how diverse and inclusive our governance is within our project, leadership, so on and so forth. So every one of those on the left side there, kind of over here, follows this same approach. So first, identify your goals. What are the things that you're trying to get at? Metrics aside, we don't even care about metrics particularly at this point. We can then focus in on, there are particular metrics that will help give you insight with respect to event diversity. All right, so if you see there, we have diversity access tickets, codes of conducts at the event, and family friendliness. Is this a full list of everything that you need to understand, in this case, diversity and inclusion at an event? Of course not. Is it a step forward to gain better insight on this and allow people who use these metrics to gain better insight? Yes, it absolutely is. So our goal in the CHAOSS project is to not only develop these focus areas that can provide insight around D&I, but then identify the goals around those focus areas, and then the subsequent metrics that can help inform those goals. All right, so we follow this goal, question, metric approach. Metrics ultimately roll up to give you clarity on a particular goal that you're trying to accomplish. So you can kind of see that original metrics for metric's sake was not doing us a lot of good because they were just kind of scattered across the board. When we start organizing this way, it allows us to think of metrics to achieve particular goals. What you're seeing here then is the template for diversity access tickets as a released metric in the CHAOSS project. All right. We have deployed these metrics in a variety of different ways. So what you're looking at here is from the Twitter open source program office with Augur running behind the scenes, right, Sean? So we have Augur running behind the scenes, which helps kind of represent the metrics that we have defined. Metrics, honestly, just in Markdown. They are just documents. Augur brings those metrics to light or to life and allows people to actually see them, localize them, and use them as appropriate for their particular context. So thank you, Sean, for doing that work. D&I, here's another deployment, right? So this is a present initiative. So these are very current. I picked some of the current badges. So when I was talking about that D&I event badging, one of the things is how do you actually deploy these metrics and get them to be meaningful for people? Well, we have a badging program that events can go through to badge their events as being committed to event D&I issues. So you see FOSS Backstage, CDCon, we have others in review. This is an open and transparent review process. So the CHAOSS project listens to what folks are trying to accomplish, the goals they're trying to accomplish, works through the metrics that can help accomplish those goals, and then thinks also through the ways that you can get those metrics out into the world as meaningful to people. So whether it's through software, like what we saw with Twitter as one example there, or whether it's through initiatives like the badging program, which doesn't really rely on software, really relies on human intervention and human thought. So that's the structure of the CHAOSS project as we stand. Moving into the future, right? Thinking about how we can use this approach and use this methodology to help organizations, to help communities, to help efforts think about how metrics can be meaningful in their particular space. Bounding search spaces, so helping kind of rein in these sometimes crazy search spaces, trying to lower complexity so you can gain a better understanding around the things that you're actually interested in gaining a better understanding about. And also a big thing that we're looking at right now is trying to manage this risk and uncertainty. So as you just kind of look out across a vast landscape of the artifacts or the projects that you're looking at, how do you kind of start understanding the risk and uncertainty that sits in that space? And I think I have done my 10 minutes and I'm done.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you very much. We now have
You
a
bet.
talk from Francoise Genova, so she will share her screen to talk about the work of the EOSC FAIR working group and what we can learn in their discussions about metrics for the FAIR principles in a broader scope. Yours, the screen, stage is yours, Francoise. Yep, we can see your screen. We're on about the third slide though. You should be able to unmute yourself, Francoise, but we can't hear you. Sorry, I see there's a note. You should be able to unmute yourself, but I don't seem to have an option to unmute you other than to ask you to unmute. Can everybody else unmute? So, sorry, as a general question, are other people able to unmute themselves? That's how it should be set up. Francoise can't. No one can unmute now.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay. There was another button, which was elsewhere. So I will share my screen again. Okay, so the point is to give a short presentation of work, some relevant work of a FAIR working group of the EOSC Executive Board. This was one of the 6 working groups of the EOSC Executive Board, and it worked for about 1.5 years and finished its work in December at the end of last year. And I was a vice chair and Sarah Jones was the chair of the group. So we had to prepare several documents, including one on FAIR practices and one on metrics, which are relevant to this context, the context we are discussing today. So I put the links to the documents is in the shared notes. So among the recommendations, there was something which is being done in the FAIR4Software working group currently, which is to work to translate the FAIR guidelines for digital objects. And this was done, this was recommended in the document about implementation of FAIR practice, and also one of the recommendations of a document on FAIR metrics. So there is also a discussion of the current activities, current at the time of the writing of the documents, about what was happening on working on FAIR4Software and the workflows and executable notebooks. And Neil knows that very well because he is one of the authors of the 6 recommendations. So I just have copied the recommendations about the definition of and implementation of metrics, because I think it can be simply good to keep them in mind. It's not as elaborated as what we heard from the chaos people a few minutes ago, but at least it's a few words which are important to keep in mind. The fact that the definition of metrics should be a continuous process, in particular feedback, taking into account feedback and from implementation by in different contexts. Another key point is inclusiveness, and also the fact that FAIR should be considered as a journey, which means that it's important to use, if there are tools to evaluate fairness, it's important to use them to measure progress, and maybe better to use them to measure progress rather than to do pass or fail evaluation, which is always biased by the tools themselves, especially at the beginning when not everything is fully tested. So the fact that there is diversity and inclusiveness, we heard already a few minutes ago. Another of the points, but it's for data, was not to reinvent the wheel, which means that the starting point at this stage for data should be the RDA FAIR data maturity model working group work. And then if there are issues with that, the idea is to go back to the group because they are in maintenance mode and they intend to maintain the recommendations. There is this issue of evaluation methods and tools, and we really strongly recommend that they are thoroughly assessed in a variety of contexts with a very broad consultation for everybody, just to make sure that they meet diverse community practices. I am not completely sure it's exactly the same thing for software, but I am sure there are diverse kinds, different kinds of software, and if there are tools, they have to be able to evaluate properly the different kinds and types of software developed by different communities. And we had this a point about the metrics have to be developed for digital objects other than data, and the fact that when you provide metrics, you have to provide guidance. So a few additional comments. I really think, because we had a look at the situation, what was going on about data, that it is essential to work on metrics when the principles are defined to avoid cacophony. I checked that the word exists also in English, cacophony of interpretations of the principles and also a cacophony of evaluation tools, each saying that they are the tool which measures fairness. We saw that there was lots of concerns about metrics expressed by the community when there was a community consultation about the EOSC strategic research and innovation agenda, which means that really metrics are acceptable if they are inclusive and if they take feedback in account. People are really worried about metrics because they think they will be thrown away because when there is metrics available. And linked to that, there is a real need to, when you define evaluation tool, to test them and to use them very cautiously. So, of course, having the specific case in mind when defining the principles and the metrics is essential, and it is what you are doing to begin with in the FAIR4 software working group. And we also had an interesting discussion about the maintenance of the FAIR guiding principles themselves. And FAIR the project FAIR had meetings around the maintenance of the turning FAIR into reality recommendation, and there was a discussion of that. And what we take from their conclusion is the fact that the FAIR guiding principle should be used as a guide and not as an article of faith, which is not what is always, it is not always done that way in the discussion about FAIR data. So I think that you have to keep that in mind for your own guiding principles, the one you will define.
Thanks, Francoise, and sorry about the messages in the chat or the messages you're getting about unmuting. We're just trying to solve that setting problem. The Menti is now working. It's a different code. It's now written into the chat. So if you go to menti.com and use the code 7955707, that I can see some people have successfully given a little bit of information about themselves and their organization, and where relevant or appropriate at this time, a bit about the work they may be doing that could be of particular use to this group. So feel free to keep adding a bit of detail to that Menti as we go through the final talk, so that everyone can know who else is in the room. And thanks for Sue Thorne for being the first person to respond and help make sure it was all working. We have now one final talk. Neil, if you could share your slide for Yehudi from the Wellcome Trust to talk about the FAIRware project. Now, Yo, are you able to unmute?
I am. Amazing. Thank you, Neil, for sharing that. So while Neil's just getting that into presentation mode, hey everyone, my name is Yo. And I work at the Wellcome Trust, a science funder based in the United Kingdom. And currently my role is the open source technology lead. And so I spend a lot of time worrying about the same sort of stuff that I think people in this group worry about, like making sure that software for research is actually reproducible and reusable and useful for people, and not just a nice story for a paper. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about FAIRware. So FAIRware is something that is being created by the Research on Research Institute, that's RORI for short, which is what's the word I'm looking for, consortium of funders and research institutes. I think there's about 20 different institutes that are part of RORI. And the goal of FAIRware is to allow researchers to actually improve the fairness of their research outputs. So it's a short-term project for the minute. It's about 1 year we're looking at. And we are in the process right now. We have actually already shortlisted, and we are in contract negotiations with a selected supplier to actually start creating this. And the goal of FAIRware, apart from just improving fairness of research outputs, is actually allowing people to work within their own research workflow in a way that allows them to very easily look at what they're doing, potentially iterate and improve what they're doing. It's not just designed to measure people and say you're good enough or you're not good enough. And I think one thing that we originally planned was that this would really cover all research outputs. But for a couple of reasons, that has been scaled back a little bit. So early on, we would have said that we wanted data and software. But realistically, as I think we've been talking about for the last half hour or so, the definition of what FAIR means for software isn't well defined. So that would have in itself made it quite hard to actually build this into FAIRware. So we're starting with a smaller scope where we're looking at assessing research data outputs. And even then, I think it's reasonable to say that it's not possible to define the fairness of all research data outputs, and that's a really broad scope. So probably we'll be looking at a much narrower, more achievable scope, or ways to look at this and improve it, with the idea that it will be highly extensible, so that we can then add on other research domains and add on software in the future. And I think one thing that I just really wanted to highlight, I think it has actually been highlighted in many of the excellent talks we've already heard today, but that it's really important that measurements, when we do end up assessing things, like if we want to build software in, for example, it's really important that we make sure that these are actionable things. So for example, if as a researcher, I upload my data to a repository and then I stick it into a tool and it says you're not fair because your repository doesn't follow some guidelines, there's literally nothing I can do about that. And so that's not the sort of bit of feedback that would really be useful to me as a researcher. So I think it's really important that we think about things that when we tell people do this, they can actually change it and action when they're worried about their about making sure that their outputs are fair. So I think hopefully within the next few weeks, you might actually see an announcement where we actually start talking about who we are, who is going to be deploying this and actually implementing FAIRware. So hopefully we should start releasing updates soon, but that should be any time now. And I think that's me.